Oh, look, Bro- Brother Noor is vacationing. Wow, the pyramids.
Pastor
Enjoying
Noor,
his tour.
did you find Moses there? He was
No,
not
he's up
able
on an
to
unknown
enter.
mountain.
He was not able to enter the promised land. Probably he went back to Egypt.
Who knows? Good morning, Anselmo. Good to see you, or at least see you're here. Welcome. Okay. Let me pull up the notes here. All right. So this morning, I want to continue on in the poetic analysis step that we're looking at here for our poetry, studying Hebrew poetry in particular. And sorry, I'm just getting my, yeah, okay, here we go. So again, we're in the poetic analysis step, a step which incorporates looking at the setting and structure of the poem, looking at the parallelism that's used in the poem. And again, Psalms and Proverbs will definitely have parallelism. Probably most of the verses you look at in the Psalm or a proverb will have parallelism. But when you go beyond those two books, Ecclesiastes, Job, the prophetic books, parallelism may be used at times, but not all the time. So it's more prevalent, more common in the Psalms and the Proverbs. And then the next step in the analysis in looking at poetry is, as we can see here, to identify the imagery and poetic devices. Again, remember, going way back to the very beginning when we started, and I mentioned to you that poetry has three, Hebrew poetry has three primary elements, right? You guys remember? Terseness, structure, and imagery. All right, terseness, structure, and imagery. Again, the terseness is the brevity, right? The short statements. The structures primarily in the form of parallelism, but sometimes there's acrostics that are used, and then stanzas, which each represent a particular unit of thought. And then finally, imagery. All right, and that's a key one. Probably I would say imagery is the poetic or the aspect of poetry that you will see in all Hebrew poetry. It will have some form of imagery. All right, that's a primary element. Not all will have parallelism, as I just mentioned before, and not all will have terseness or short statements, but definitely it will contain some form of imagery, some picture that the poet is trying to paint, or sometimes multiple pictures that he is trying to draw through his words. All right, and that imagery is often conveyed through the use of poetic devices. All right, and those poetic devices come in two aspects. You have poetic devices in the form of what's called figurative language. All right, and then there's another, I just call it other poetic devices, because they don't really fill a category. They're particular devices, and each of these poetic devices are used by the poet to again draw that picture for us, to convey the emotion of the text, to help us understand the tone of the poem, to convey focus. All right, so these are the things that are used: figurative language and poetic devices. So we're going to spend we've spent time looking at that already in detail, and now what we're going to do is simply apply that to a particular passage. In our case, Psalm 128. That's our example passage of focus. All right, so with that, let's briefly again, let me just talk about imagery, and then we'll go right to Psalm 128, and I'll have you examine it, see if you can find the images. Again, remember, as you look at a poem in this step, the first thing you want to do after you've read and observed the poem, after you have identified the setting and structure of the poem, after you've looked at the parallelism in each verse of the poem, the next step is to identify the imagery. All right, and so that all that entails simply is look for what images do you see in the poem, and then what is the meaning of those images, and how would the original audience, this is important, how would the original audience have understood that particular image? All right, so these are just some questions to consider as you're looking at the imagery and describing the imagery. You want to not only note what image it is, like, oh, here are the, for example, let's just do an example. All right, Psalm 23, for example. Okay, as you look at the image here, it's not just, okay, there's an image of the Lord as a shepherd leading sheep. There's a picture of sheep in a pasture that are cared for and protected. Okay, that's the image in this psalm. All right, so that's what you want to identify, but then you want to identify, okay, what's the significance of that image, particularly to the original audience? So how would people in that culture have understood this particular image? And we know that in the ancient Near East, sheep were a key part of the culture. There were shepherds and sheep all throughout the Middle East, particularly in Israel. And so what would this picture of Yahweh being a shepherd leading his sheep to fertile land and protecting them, what would that communicate to the original audience in particular? What meaning would it have? What emotions would it draw out? Okay, and so that's what you're supposed to do in this step. So this step really is just examine what images do you see there? What's the significance of those images? How would they be understood by the original audience? What emotion does that image convey? All right, so you would just sort of write that out in a few sentences. Okay, so for Psalm 23, you might say the image is of Yahweh as a shepherd, and we are the sheep, and the picture is the sheep being brought to a place of protection and provision and care and peace. Okay, now this image would convey a sense of a happiness, right? Of feeling peace, feeling comforted, protected, even in difficult times. So that's kind of how you would describe it, just in a few sentences. All right, and then another image that's presented is, notice in verse 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. So one picture is of him being provided for and protected against his enemies, even being given a meal. And then you anoint my head with oil, this idea of oil as a healing substance that provides healing and provides comfort. And so again, that's another picture. So there's multiple pictures typically in most poems. Some poems there may be just one image, but some poems will have many images, and those images could be described in either one verse, as in verse 5, or in several verses, as in verses 1 to 4. Okay, so these images can vary between part of a verse to several verses in how they are described. Okay, so the idea is just what images are being given. As you read the poem, what picture is meant to is the author trying to develop in your mind? And again, we have a picture of sheep in a meadow. We have a picture of eating at a table before one's enemies. We have a picture of a person being anointed with oil on their head. And then we even have a picture of being followed or pursued by something, in this case, goodness and love. So there's several images within this poem. These 6 verses, we have 3, maybe 4 images that are being described. And the way these images are described is through the use of figurative language and other poetic devices that we'll look at in a minute. Okay? Any questions on that? I know it's been several weeks since we talked about this last, but you guys have any questions before we look to Psalm 128 as an example? Okay, so let's do that then. Psalm 128 that we've been using as sort of our example psalm to go through prophetic analysis on. I want to now do this step of imagery. So what I'd like you to do is we'll read this psalm. I'll ask if Pastor Arn, if you could read this psalm, and then I want you guys to take a few minutes on your own and just look at this psalm carefully, read through it a few times on your own, see if you can identify any pictures, any images that are given within this psalm, okay? So Pastor Arn, if you could read this psalm for us, and then brothers, take a few minutes to examine it on your own for imagery, all right?
Is it Psalm 128, Pastor?
Yes, sir. Psalm 128 here, I'll put it on the right side here. Okay.
Okay.
And then this side I'll have the. All right, go ahead.
A Song of Ascents, verse 1. How blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. When you shall eat the fruit of your hands, you will be happy, and it will be with you. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine within your house, your children like olive plants around your table. Behold, for thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion, and may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Indeed, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel.
All right, thank you. So go ahead, take a few minutes, guys, and just see what pictures do you see in this poem? What images do you see? And I'll leave the questions here on the left. Just look at those questions and try to answer them for each image, especially what would the meaning, what meaning would that convey or significance? What emotions are emphasized? All right, I didn't focus on those things, okay, for each image. So I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll come back together. All right. Okay. So let's see what you guys came up with here as we think about the images here. All right, anybody want to tell us maybe one of the images that you see? Yeah, Sid?
We have here, Pastor Tim, a fruitful vine.
Yeah, what verse?
Verse 2, verse 3, fruitful vine.
Yeah, the wife is described as a fruitful vine,
and
vine. So let's
image of olive plants.
Okay. We also have olive plants. Both of these described as growing in his home. There are metaphors, right, for the wife and the children.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
picture of a hardworking farmer.
Okay, a hardworking farmer, or more specifically, even the fruit of his labor, right?
Yeah.
Because the picture isn't the farmer, it's actually eating the
Okay.
the fruit. Let's see.
Enjoying the food
Yeah,
of his own work.
yeah, as a blessing.
Tim,
Yeah.
how about verse 1? Everyone who fears the Lord and who walks in his ways. Fears the Lord and then walks in his ways.
Yeah, those are descriptions, but
Aren't they images also of describing, of course, everyone who has that characteristic in them and therefore they're walking.
yeah, and we just have to make sure we distinguish between a statement that's made and actually a picture being described. And so I would say that everyone who fears the Lord is a statement that he's making. But actually then in the verses 2 and 3, there are pictures being presented of what happens when a man fears the Lord. And so, for example, verse 5, the Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem. May you see your children's children. Those aren't necessarily images being described as they are statements being made. So we kind of have to, sometimes it's hard to distinguish, okay? But what we're looking for is mainly what's being pictured. And that's where we'll see figurative language being used. Notice he says, your wife shall be like a fruitful vine, right? That's the, like a metaphor. Your children will be like olive plants.
So, Pastor Tim, there must be a comparison for a figurative language to be established.
Not always, but that will often be an example. Like Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Well, he's not literally a shepherd.
Statement.
Yeah. It's and your wife is not literally a grapevine. Right? But it's a picture of a wife. It's a picture that's meant to communicate a truth through the picture. Because he could have just said, you know, your wife will give you many children, will work hard, will make you happy, will, right? That's a description. But when he says your wife shall be like a fruitful vine, that's a picture. And in the picture, it gives us a description, but it's meant to be more, it's poetry. So it's going to be more emotional. It's going to be more visual, so to speak. It's going to be more aesthetic, more like, how do I describe the word aesthetic? Quality, skillful way to present a particular statement.
How about second part of verse 3, Pastor Tim?
Yes, olive
Is a
plant?
family time. No, the second part, family time. They are eating together.
Yeah. Well, he describes the picture is at the location, right? Your wife will be like a fruitful vine in your house. That's one picture. Your children like olive plants around your table. That's a second picture.
Okay.
It's all part, yeah. So yeah, this is one picture, and then this is another picture. It's an image. Again, the children are not literal olive plants, but he's giving us an image that communicates a message. They're like olive plants around your table. And yeah, I think the table is the idea of the family gathering to eat, to be together. But there he's saying when your family gathers, those children that are there, and then he describes this picture of them being like olive plants or olive shoots. I think, I don't know, what does the ESV say? Olive shoots in the ESV. All right, so these little olive plants coming out of the ground. Again, it's not literal, but it is a picture. Okay, so good. So anyone see any others that are actual pictures, not just descriptions or things like that?
It's giving us a whole concept of agriculture.
Yes, good. Those images in verses 2 and 3 together, right? These are all agricultural, right? Which would be significant in ancient Near Eastern culture, right? Because, well, let's look at each of these. All right. So if we take each of these images now, and again, looking at what I mentioned before, we want to consider these questions. Okay. What the meaning does it convey? What emotions does it convey? How would the original audience have understood? So let's again think about, okay, this psalm is written first to whom? When we looked at the
To the
context.
pilgrims going
Yes.
up to worship.
The Israelites.
Yeah, to the Israeli pilgrims who were journeying to Jerusalem. That's why the Song of Ascents tells us that. Journeying to Jerusalem during one of the 3 annual feasts, right? One of those being near the Feast of Harvest, by the way. So these people are agrarian, right? They're agricultural primarily. So this imagery, what kind of agriculture is being described here? Let's look at the first one. We'll call it image 1. All right, when he says the fruit of your hands. All right, now we're not told what kind of fruit. We're just told fruit. So it could be, grain. It could be literal fruit. It could be, it could even perhaps be, animals that he's raised. We're not told exactly what it is, but clearly it's something that he has invested in, labored for, right? Either agriculturally or something like that. So when it says you shall eat the fruit of your hands, what is that conveying? What is that image communicating?
Hardworking.
Okay, good. So
Great harvest.
great harvest. So there's been hard work. Great
Result
harvest.
of one's work. Result of one's work or labor.
What kind of emotion or tone or feelings are expressed in this image?
Satisfaction.
Yeah, he even says it explicitly, right? You will be happy.
Happiness.
Yeah. Satisfaction, happiness, right? I don't know, you guys, when I was younger, I worked with my grandfather, my Lolo, to raise crops. We grew corn, we grew watermelons. We didn't live in on the equator, so we had different kind of foods, tomatoes. And my grandfather and I, we would, once the harvest came, we would, sit in the field and pick some tomatoes and just eat them. And some of my best memories of my childhood were sitting with my Lolo eating this fruit that we had. We dug the ground, we planted the seed, we brought, fertilizer, we watered it. Of course, God was the one, right, ultimately who provided, but such enjoyment knowing we labored, and then the taste and so I think right? Those of you who have grown crops, you know, you can experience this. I think that's the picture here, right? The feelings of happiness, satisfaction, I don't know, any others that come to mind?
Wholeness.
Wholeness, like this? Is that what you,
Yes, Pastor.
okay. Yeah, that comes with the satisfaction, the contentment. The good feelings, right? Especially if you relied on these crops for your livelihood, right? Relief even, right? Because you
Thanksgiving,
know,
Pastor Tim.
what's that?
Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving, yeah.
Comfort.
Comfort, good. Okay, all of these would be part of what would be conveyed to the original audience, right? They would understand this image. Okay, good. And there's many verses we could look at in the Old Testament that would sort of describe, you know, the importance of crops, you know, and even God said that in Deuteronomy 28 or Leviticus 26, you know, when they were walking with the Lord and obeying his covenant, that he would bless their fields. But if they did not obey, that there would be drought, there would be famine, there would be locusts, right? And so there's much, you know, in the Old Testament about the importance and the joy and the contentment and peace that a fruitful crop brings you. All right. And also too, guys, in thinking about that, if you think about Deuteronomy 28 or Leviticus 26, if you have a fruitful crop, that could indicate that you are you know, obeying or being faithful. He is rewarding you. And that's the idea here, right? In the Psalm, that this is exactly what is said in verse 2. It's a reward. So there's the feelings that would come from knowing God is pleased and he is blessing you, right? So that as well. Okay, how about the second image? Again, these images are just one verse long, right? They're not a long description. And in fact, the second image is only half of a verse. Okay? Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine within your house. What does that image convey? What picture, what emotions, what feelings, what seems to be the focus there?
A continuous fruit.
Okay, good. Continuous fruit. Yeah, because fruitful has the idea of abundance, right? Continuous fruit, abundance. All right, and it's a vine. What is a vine? What kind of fruit are we talking about here?
Grapes.
Yeah. And think about, again, in that culture, what do grapes provide?
Wine.
Okay, there's yeah, alcohol. Woo! And we know what that does. But when taken in moderation, right? The Lord doesn't forbid drinking alcohol, just getting drunk, he forbids. But wine, what does wine produce? If you drink a little bit of wine,
Joy.
joy.
It will become
Okay,
By
joy.
gore.
Pardon?
it will be like a medicine to your stomach.
Yeah, even in Paul tells Timothy that, right? Take a little wine for your stomach. So it has some healing properties, and we know actually grapes are rich in iron and can be helpful for energy. Okay. They would be a means of commerce, right? Because you might sell grapes or wine to somebody to provide income. Now, here's something really important. Now, obviously, we have a picture of grapes, and and you would have a picture in your culture and society of what grapes provide, and we have the same here. I've grown grapes before. They're actually kind of hard to grow, good ones. But we have to remember, okay, we got to try to think as best we can like an ancient Near Eastern Jew, okay? And what would the image of vines produce, or what would come to their mind as we think about vines? And what you want to do is really try to look up in the Old Testament any passages that mention vines. All right, because what I've seen is this passage in particular, commentators look at fruitful vine and they automatically assume children. They think, oh, that means your wife will have lots of children. Okay, well, let's think about that a minute. It could convey that idea, but is that what the Old Testament, the picture the Old Testament develops about the vine? And here I just put, I won't go through all of these. They'll be in your notes, so you can look them up if you would like. But these are all of the things I found regarding wine, grapes, and the significance they would have for, in the Old Testament anyway. They're described as something that gives sustenance, right? So grapes are actually food, can give you energy and strength. They're sweet smelling. The Song of Songs describes the wife. Oh, by the way, these are characteristics of the fruitful vine with a wife. All right. Vines are described as shade and protection in 1 Kings 4. So let's look, for example, we'll look at some of these since I can do that. All right, and here the vine is described in Joseph's dream, or Pharaoh's dream with Joseph. And the vine is described as something that produced ripe grapes, and the grapes were given to Pharaoh to give him sustenance. I think the same in 2 Kings 18. Hezekiah was telling or the king of Assyria was saying to eat his vine, and so it's describing a little bit how it provides, it's a means of sustenance. Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. The vines and the blossom have given their fragrance. So he's describing the vineyards. You go out there, you can smell them. There's a sweet smell to them. Hosea 14 is described. There's a beauty there, a blossom. His renown or beauty will be like the wine of Lebanon. So anyway, 1 Kings 4. And you'll have these passages. You can look them up. But all I did was just sort of look up. So the vine here is described, as a place of shade, safety even. And so going through the Old Testament passages, the vine actually has a lot of functions and various ways that it's valuable or desired. All right. So the wife is depicted as a fruitful vine that bears many grapes. A vine can bear many grapes, but we have to be careful we don't presume that. All right, we want to know, what would the Old Testament person have understood from that being a vine being fruitful? What would that signify? What would that say to them? And I think it would include all of these kinds of things. So if the wife is a fruitful vine, she's not just giving lots of grapes, lots of children, but the idea of a fruitful vine brings sustenance, brings joy, brings peace, brings
abundant life,
comfort.
Pastor.
What's that, Kazo?
abundant life, signifies
Yeah.
abundant life, the vine.
Yeah, I think so. And so again, what we're trying to do is just simply, what would the person reading this, one of these Jews that were singing this psalm as they're going into Jerusalem and they're singing about a fruitful vine, what would that convey to them? What would they understand that to mean? All right. They're the original audience to whom this poem was written. And so it's important. What would the author in that day be saying to his hearers in that day? Not just what we assume it means, but what they would understand it to mean. So a fruitful vine, again, is more than just producing a lot of grapes, and that the grapes refer to children. I think the fruitful vine was a much broader image that would bring joy and happiness and energy and vitality through the grapes, even through the leaves of the vine. It's described as a place of shade and comfort. All right, so that's the idea. Is you want to, when you see these images, you want to understand, again, the key question is, what would this image mean and convey to the original hearers or readers, or in this case, singers? Okay. Not just what I think, what would a fruitful vine mean to me? Right? For some people who like alcohol, they may just think, oh, that just means I get, I get to drink a lot and I'm happy. But that's not all that's being communicated here. Certainly that may be one image or part one product of that image. Does this make sense? You guys following what I'm saying here?
Yes.
Again, we're back to authorial intent, original audience. That hermeneutic.
Pastor Tim,
Yes, Alex.
I think, or maybe not think, but I believe the better picture here is given in Proverbs 31, verse 10 to 31.
That describes a
Wife. A wife.
wife, why have I drawn a
He who
blank?
finds a wife finds a treasure.
Yeah,
Oops.
the godly wife, certainly that might be a full picture. But again, we don't want to, insofar as that picture conveys what, or that proverb conveys what this picture of a fruitful vine would give, then yes. A fruitful vine doesn't work hard. It just produces these grapes. So it's the product that's the focus here. But yeah, certainly you could draw some illustrations from Proverbs 31 on that. And again, notice the connection. Just as we're looking at this particular psalm, notice the connection here is that kind of a wife is of the man who fears the Lord and walks in his ways. We'll come back to that, but keep that in mind. So yeah, there's other places that might illustrate some of the idea, like Proverbs 31, as Alex mentions. I don't think a vine is mentioned there at all, but certainly some of the things the woman does would be consistent with what we see here as a fruitful vine and what that would mean to them. And then the third image right here is the children, your children like olive plants. Right? And again, we want to ask ourselves, okay, so what was the significance? Because notice he didn't say your children will be like a fruitful vine. He called them olive plants. So it's a different crop. It's a different type of, it's not It's not a vine, a grapevine. It's an olive tree or a shoot, you know, a little sprout coming up. So we'd have to ask, okay, again, what would this image mean to them, to the Jewish pilgrims, the Israeli pilgrims in the ancient Near East times? Okay, what's the significance of olives in that day?
Source of oil for cooking.
Yes, certainly we see examples in, and I have some passages here below, but oil, right? Oil, olive oil was used for, right, cooking, right? We see that Habakkuk 3, we'll just already have some passages. The yield of the olive should fail and the fields produce no food. Right, so there the olive's described as something to eat. What else do we know about an olive from the ancient Near Eastern times that it was used for?
Olive oil is
also there.
All right, Anselmo?
Useful also in the temple for their lamp.
Yes, was used for the lamps, not only in the temple, but also they used them in, the people used them for themselves as well, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good. Exodus 27 describes oil being used for lamps. And then, of course, later in Jesus's day, right, the parable of the 10 virgins with their oil. That was several hundred years later, but after the psalm was written. Okay, Nor, you had something?
It is a great income to the family.
Yes, income, right?
Yeah.
Because olives, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, then the great trade in the grow up and sell it.
Yeah, because of its many uses, olives and olive oil were very desired commodity in the ancient Near East. So yeah, that's a key. It would provides income. All right, and so any other uses? We'll come back to that because that's a key point that Nor makes. Any
I
other
think
uses?
it represents new life because the dove that was sent by Noah brought back an olive branch.
So yeah,
Means that life is already returned from the earth.
yeah, back when at the flood, yeah, when he came back with an olive branch, which is kind of an interesting part of that story for sure. All right, good. Anything else comes to your mind?
medicinal uses used to dress wounds.
Yeah, medicinal uses. And we see that later in the New Testament. It's described in James 5, I think, to anoint with oil. There's also some spiritual significance to that as well in James. But I think there actually was some, you know, if you were sick, to use oil wasn't just, where is it here? Yeah, anointing him with oil. So certainly there's some significance there regarding spiritually speaking, but I think even in a literal sense, the oil, that's showing the, showing the medicinal value or effect of it. It was used for anointing kings. Remember, they used oil.
Yeah.
That was another. Okay, there we go. So all that comes back to this idea that I think, as Nor mentioned, the olive was the olive tree, olive oil was a source of great income. In fact, Jeremiah,
Jeremiah 11.
yeah, the Lord
Israel
calls
is
the name the green olive tree,
olive
beautiful in
tree,
fruit. What's that?
a green olive tree, beautiful in fruit and form.
Yeah.
And verse 17, the Lord of hosts planted Israel.
And so this is idea of prosperity
Israel.
being conveyed. I think Psalm 52 is another place. Maybe not. Oh yeah. I'm like a green olive tree in the house of the God. So this is kind of this idea of joyful prosperity, blessing. So again, you just want to sort of understand. So when he says that your children will be like an olive shoots, again, they're olive plants, they're not yet trees. So this is, in the future, right? They will be all like olive trees. Well, what does that convey then? If we knew our children were like
Symbol of,
olive trees, what's that, Kazo?
symbol of longevity.
Let's see. Convey longevity, is that what you said? Okay. In what sense? What would knowing, if you knew you had a crop of olive trees that were growing, what would that tell you? Or
Hope for the future.
yeah, provision, right? You have a future source of income, and then even, olive being useful for all these other things. And so there was a sense of future security. All right, so we see the image of the fruitful vine as sort of present blessing and joy, and then the picture of the olive plants, again, as a future security. All right, you see how that each image has its own, it's communicating something a little different. Both of them are connected, I think, as Alex mentioned earlier. I think Alex said it, the agricultural, they're all connected agriculturally. Maybe it was you, Michael, I forget, but they have there's a different focus from each of these images. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts about this before we move
Pastor
on?
Tim,
Yeah.
it is like buying insurance policy.
Yeah, sort of. Right. Or maybe, like insurance, or even an inheritance, or an investment. That each of these brings sort of a feeling of security. And I think you mentioned even hope, right? If you know there's something in the future that will provide for you, that brings a sense of security. Whereas the fruitful vine, it's more the idea of present blessing, that there's joy and peace, there's a satisfaction in the present. The children being like olive plants, there's a sort of future security there. You know that there's hope in the future. All right. Any other comments or questions? Again, the key here is this point about what that image would convey to those who at the time, who the original audience. All right, now again, every poem, as far as I know, every poem or most every poem will have some sort of image being described, and often it will be described through figurative language, which takes us to the next step in this poetic analysis, and that is, as we're looking at the imagery, we also want to identify what is the figurative language used. And I don't know if you remember, a couple months ago now, we went through all these different kinds of figures of speech or figurative language. All right, we had
The
Sid.
one used there is simile, with the use of the word like.
Yeah, we see simile here. So we're gonna analyze the poem in a minute here. But yeah, there's figurative language of comparison. And again, remember, when we say figure of speech, what we're talking about is that the words used aren't intended to be interpreted literally. Okay, they do have a literal meaning. They're meant to convey an idea or a point, but that point is not being conveyed in a literal sense. So for example, like I said, in this psalm, he may have said, when you how blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. And then he could have said, you will experience your labor will produce much. You'll produce much from your labor that will give you satisfaction and joy. Okay, that would be a literal way to say it. But here he says, you shall eat of the fruit of your hands. That's more of a figure of speech, imagery. All right, again, because fruit of the hands may be referring to, literal food, or just any of your labor. You will enjoy the success of it if you fear the Lord. And so comparison is one very, very common form of figure of speech. There's the simile, and as my brother Sid noted, a simile will use words like or as, right? A simile will be, right, he is like a shepherd. Now, a metaphor would be a stronger comparison. He is a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. And then hypocatastasis is the strongest comparison, where you might say, the Lord, the shepherd, or something like that. It's more direct. So those are the forms of comparison. Then we also had attributing features, if you'll remember, right? That a personification was describing an inanimate object or a non-person or non-human with a human characteristic. Like the trees of the field clap their hands. The rivers shout for joy, right? Those are personifications. Now, when it's a personification or a human attribute attributed to God, we call that an anthropomorphism. Anthropos is man, and morphism is form. So like, again, the hand of the Lord, the eyes of the Lord saw. Those are human attributes that are God's being described by them. Now, he doesn't have eyes or hands, but it's a description in order to convey an idea. All right, what do hands do? What do eyes do? Zoomorphism would be animal characteristics, the talons of the Lord, the claws of God, or the wings of the Lord. All right, so those are all what I call attributing features. That is, features of something describing something else, either of a human, something non-human being described as a human, or something, or God being described with animal-like characteristics. Okay, and then there was the class of substitution, where we had metonymy, where that is one word, one particular thing that represents another. So if I were to say, oh, Ephraim, how long must I put up with you? Now, God would not be speaking to a man named Ephraim, he's speaking to a country. But that Ephraim represents, the tribe of Ephraim represents the whole country. Synecdoche would be part of something that represents the whole. The hand of the Lord moved among his people. Well, it's not just a hand, moving along. It's describing God himself and the hand sort of representing him. So it's a part of something that represents the whole. Euphemism we didn't talk about last time. We see that in the Bible occasionally. It's a word that's used in place of another word or phrase that may be offensive or unpleasant. Like a very common one in the New Testament is sleep. Remember in 1 Corinthians 11, when he's talking about they were taking communion in an unworthy manner, and then he said, some of you sleep, right? That's a euphemism for death, right? He really meant some of you are dying. In fact, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen is described as, instead of dying, that he went to sleep. So that's called a euphemism because it's one word replacing another. Or for example, we might use different ways to describe things that may be offensive in a culture. Like for a long time, to speak about a woman's pregnancy was not considered appropriate. But you might say there's a bun in the oven, or I don't know what was some other
In her
expression.
family way.
Yeah,
In her
yes.
family way.
That's a good example. Or if people were having sex, you wouldn't necessarily say it that way. You might say they are sleeping together. Well, they're doing more than
known
sleeping.
each other.
Huh?
Known each other. Known
They
each
know
other.
each, yeah.
Like,
yeah, that's a good example.
like Adam know Abe.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good example of a euphemism in scripture, is he knew his wife. Well, it's more than just he knew her, right? It's speaking of that act of intimacy. So sometimes, or it can be used in place of a word that's, really offensive. You might say, like, for example, in Philippians, when Paul talks about, some translations, when he says, my righteous deeds or acts were like dung, poop, or maybe even a stronger word for that. But the translation might say refuse. That's a euphemism. He's not talking about garbage. He's talking about poop. So, I mean, but that's kind of a, can be offensive to some people to say that. So they use a word that softens
That's a
it a
taboo.
little bit. Okay.
That's a taboo.
Taboo. Yeah. Yeah. So a euphemism would be a word that's really, it's figurative, because it's not, like when Paul said many fall asleep because they take communion in an unworthy manner, he didn't mean they were just taking a nap. He meant they were dying, but he didn't use the word for dying. And then finally, there's idiom. An idiom is an expression, a commonly understood expression whose meaning is not discernible from the words used. So it's kind of like a euphemism, except it's more general, and it's some expression that is used to, it's figurative, but it's understood to mean something else. Okay. And we looked at a lot of examples. I didn't want to spend a lot of time going back and going through all the examples, but we can do that if we need to. But I wanted to just sort of remind you some of these. Hyperbole, and that's using exaggeration for emphasis. I cried all day and all night. Okay, well, that's not, I literally didn't cry every second all through the day and all through the night, but it's a way to exaggerate, to express I had great sorrow and shed many tears. Irony. It's where the author intentionally means something different or opposite to what he says. Okay. Wordplay, clever use of words that sound alike or look similar to another word, and that's harder to see in English in translations because we don't have the original Hebrew. But once in a while you can notice that. And then finally, merism, that communicates totality using two usually contrasting words. So again, like my tears, I shed tears day and night. Well, day and night, again, is not literal. It just means for a long period of time. Okay, for as far as the east is from the west, or the sun, moon, and stars, or the earth and the heavens, from everlasting to everlasting. Right, these are expressions that convey a totality of something. In describing by using these two words, sometimes contrasting words. All right. So I don't know. I hope some of that jogged your memory a little from what we looked at before. What I'd like to do is just have you take a few minutes, go through this Psalm 128, and see if you can identify any figures of speech. Now, not every verse will have them, so don't try to force it. But as you look at it, just ask yourself the question, is this literal? In other words, if I interpret each word here literally, is that what that means? Okay? And if it doesn't, then it's some figure of speech being used. Okay? Any questions? All right, so I'm going to leave the list here to the left and just go through each verse, and I'll give you a few minutes to do this and see what you can find. All right, and then we'll go around. I'll call on each of you to just with each verse and see what you found. All right. All right, so go ahead. Let me start the recording here. Okay. Well, let's go verse by verse, and then I'll give you verse 3 in a minute, Brito, but let's do verse 1. Anybody see anything in verse 1?
I think verse 1, Pastor, has merism because of the word blessed and fierce. I think that is too contrasting.
Okay. Okay, blessed. Now, merism, yes, those words are different, maybe even a little opposite in meaning, but a merism would be two things that are meant to convey a totality of something. So here we're just seeing, this is just a contrast, I think there.
A contrast, okay.
Yeah. So
contrast.
When merism's used when you want to convey the vastness of something, the extensiveness of something. Day and night, heaven and earth, everlasting to everlasting. Okay, so those describe like a vastness.
Okay.
I should probably even put that in the description here. That might make it more clear. Where is it? Metonymy, merism.
Lower portion.
Okay. But there is a figure of speech in verse 1. It's not a merism though. Anyone have an idea? Again, look at each. Okay, how blessed is everyone who fears the Lord. Okay, do you guys think that's literal? Yeah, it is. Okay, how about who walks in his ways? Is that literal?
It's figurative.
No, figurative.
It's figurative. No one can walk in his ways.
Yeah, you don't walk in God's way. You don't
ways.
literally walk. Okay, so
but
it is
obedient.
figurative. Now the question is, what? Now we know it means the idea of obedience, right?
Yes.
Following
yes.
God's commands. So what kind of figure of speech is this? You think? Oh, here, let me. Okay, this will be a challenge. How do we want to do this? Okay, let's do this. All right, give me a second here. I'm gonna. Oh, nuts. Okay. All right, sorry guys, give me a second. I'm gonna put this over here. Oh, well, that helped. Let's see here. Okay, how about that? All right, there we go. All right, so we'll keep that over here. And then okay. And on this side, we'll just do the verse, each verse here. So verse 1. All right. So what kind of figure of speech might this be? Who walk in his ways? That word walk.
Hypocatastasis, Pastor Tim. Hypocatastasis.
Okay, is it making a comparison? He's not being compared to something.
Our walk is compared to his
Comparison.
walk.
Well,
Our
no,
walk
it
is
would
compared
say
to his walk.
you would see the
Euphemism.
idea of live and walk together, but you don't. Walk just represents live.
Euphemism, Pastor. Substitution.
Euphemism, could be. I mean, this is not an offensive or harsh word, though, to live. Think of
What kind of word is that?
That's
it is a
Pastor Tim.
substitution, right? It's
It's
one
a
word being substituted for
substitution.
another.
It's a word play, Pastor Tim. It's a word play.
No, it's not.
No, then that would have to be
Pun. It's a pun.
pun.
If it's wordplay.
It's a
Idiom.
substitution. Okay, going on here.
Idiom.
Yeah, it's an idiom, actually. If you look in the Bible, walk is used quite often. It's a commonly used expression to refer to how one lives. We see it a lot, actually.
Yeah.
So it's, in this case, it's actually an idiom that refers to how one lives or conducts their life. There's an example in Ephesians 2, right?
5. Ephesians 5 also.
Yeah. And notice here,
Ephesians 4.
look at verse, let's see. Nora, do you want to read verses 1 to 3?
And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you were formerly walked, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Among them we all. Okay, thank you. You remember that?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot.
Verse 3.
Yeah.
Among them we too all formerly lived in the lust of our flesh, indulging the desire of the flesh and of the mind. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest.
Yeah, notice here, Paul actually uses both the idiom and the literal term. Notice he says the sins in which you formerly walked. You guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then among them, we too all formerly lived. So here, Paul even gives both. And then, yeah, somebody mentioned Ephesians 4.
Verse 1.
Yeah, 1, walk in a manner worthy. Again, it's not literal walking. He's not saying, okay, brothers and sisters, go out and exercise. Do some walking for your health. Yeah, no, walking though, not lifting, walking. Right, go around the, what's the track there in Cagayan?
Sports Center Oval.
Sports Center.
Elias,
Yeah,
Elias
that oval.
Sports
Elias
Center.
Sports Center.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we used, my wife and I walked there every day when we were there last time. But no, he's not talking about a literal walk. He's talking about how you live. Or I think Noor, you said Ephesians 5.
Yes.
Oh yeah, walk not as
A lot of
smart.
walks.
Be careful how you walk. Not as wise men, but as not as unwise, but as wise. So we see, and then this idiom is used a lot in the Old Testament. If you look up the idea of walk, you'll see it used. So it's really an idiom. It's an expression, a commonly used expression to refer, to substitute, to represent something else. And in this case, it represents, walk represents how you live, how you conduct your life. All right? All right, let's look at verse 2 here. Any figure of speech here in verse 2. And let me do this. All right, then I'll go to
No.
Eat the fruit. Hands.
yeah, the question we have to ask is he speaking of literal fruit here? Fruit of your hands. Do our hands produce fruit?
Oh,
No, not literally, right? Fruit doesn't pop out of my hands, but I use them to work. Okay, so if fruit, because if it said fruit of your trees, okay, yeah, that's literal, right? Trees produce fruit. But here he's saying fruit of your hands. Okay, so that's not literal. So here fruit represents something, right? Either it could mean crops, it could mean, you know, other type of labor. So what might that expression mean? Again, this is an idea of substitution going on here.
That's another case of idiom, Pastor Tim.
Yes, it's another idiom. Refers
It's another
to
idiom.
what's that, Michael?
Hands, or it's another idiom, refers to hands as work, something like that.
Yeah, maybe the
working
product
hands.
of your labor.
Labor, yeah.
Could be literal fruit from the field. Okay, but again, the hand doesn't produce the fruit doesn't come out of the hand. That's why we know this is figurative. All right, but it could be actual fruit. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
but
The man is not lazy.
yeah, not a lazy person here. Because the focus is his labor. Okay, and then the next line we just look at, you will be happy and it will be well with you. Do you think that's literal?
Yes.
I think so,
Yes.
right? He's saying you'll be happy. Things will
For
be-
sure.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Now, Brio, you mentioned verse 3, so we'll let you. Are you there? Brio?
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. All right.
Uh,
So what do you see in verse 3?
Using a simile, sir, wife like
Vine.
vine, then
Yeah,
son
wife like.
like an olive shoot.
Yeah, there's actually two here that we talked about already earlier when we were discussing images. Okay, children like. Okay, now
Olive
again,
shoot.
it's a comparison here. And the wife is not literally a fruitful vine. She's being compared to a fruitful vine. Now, notice, by the way, as well, within your house, is that literal? Yeah. Right?
Yes.
The wife in your home. But the like a fruitful vine, that's a figurative statement. Right? And the same with children, like olive plants. Okay, so that also is figurative, but notice he says around your table. And I believe there that to be a literal idea as they gather around a table, either to eat or, as Noor said, for family, the family gathering place. Because remember, back in those times, and even today, but back in those times, you know, the places they lived were very small and there wasn't a lot of furniture, but often there'd be a table or a place where the family would eat together and meet together, and they'd have a one-room area to live. Maybe they had stairs going up to the roof, and they would use the roof also as a place to gather, but it was safer downstairs, right? So the kids. So here's an example of a figurative language, and also mixed with the literal idea as well. Okay. All right, good.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments about this so far? All right, let's see if we can finish this here. Oops. All right, verse 4. Anybody see any in verse 4? Again, we ask the question, thus shall the man be blessed. Is that a literal, do we think that's a literal statement?
Yes.
Yeah. Who fears the Lord. I think that's
Sure.
also. Now, the meaning of fear, again, there could be a range of meaning in that word.
Reverence.
Pardon? Reverence, yes. This idea of relationship. So, but that's just in the meaning of the word fear. But that's not a figurative expression. All right. Okay.
It's not afraid of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not terror necessarily, but the word can mean terror depending on the context. But in either case, it's not figurative here. It is literal. All right, now verse 5. So yeah, there's nothing in verse 4. How about verse 5? The Lord bless you from Zion. Let's think about it. Is that literal?
Figurative.
And what would be figurative about it?
Because it's not, I think what is being depicted is that the temple is, the temple of the Lord was located in Zion, in Jerusalem. So it's a symbol of his presence.
Okay.
So that's what's being depicted.
Okay, or what, looking at the list over here, what possible figure of speech could it be?
That's another idiom.
Maybe an idiom, or it's you said a symbol, so you're saying it's one thing that representing another, or it's being substituted for another, right? If it seems to be referring to God's presence, or place of dwelling, then what? And we know it's a substitution, so it's got to be one of these here.
Metonymy.
Yeah, I think metonymy.
Metonymy.
Right, just like we would say, may you find favor at the throne. Okay, now it's not referring literally that the throne would give you favor, but obviously the king on the throne, right? The place represents the location of where the king resides. I think in the same way, Zion here is a metonymy. It represents God's
Israel.
dwelling,
Jerusalem.
presence, right? Yeah, and it could refer to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's mentioned in the next line. So it is referring to an actual place, but I think here again, like I said, the throne is an actual object. It's a literal object, but it's used in this sentence to convey the idea of, the king, or find favor with the king. All right. So Zion here could also be just a reference to being blessed. Yes, from Zion, it's a literal place, but it's this idea of where God dwells. I mean, he dwells in heaven. Well, he actually dwells everywhere, right? He's omnipresent. So this isn't, I'm not certain of this, but I think it's a likely idea that it's Zion representing the presence of God or the place where he dwells, but it might just be, literally just an expression of the temple. But metonymy is a possibility here. Then we have verse, so then, may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Do you think anything in here is figurative, or is that literal?
All the days of your life, Pastor Tim. That's not literal.
Okay, all the days of your life, though it could be though, right? Every day? May you see prosperity every day of your life, all the days of your life.
Like the one crying day and night.
Yeah, and if it had said, may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem day and night, that might be more of a figurative idea. But here, all the days, I think he's literally just saying every day that you live, may you see prosperity, the prosperity of Jerusalem. So I think it actually is literal. Now, he didn't say all day, every day, right? He just said all the days, and days can refer just in a general sense to a period of time.
To a lifespan.
Yeah, lifespan. Yes. For your whole life.
Tim,
Yeah.
it convey also the idea of the mutual relationship with the Lord, with the God of Israel.
Yeah.
The man who fears the Lord. So it's not anyone.
Yes. And this is a prayer too, by the way, as we talked about before, right? May you see your children's children. It's a request, really. But yeah, I think it's focused still on the man being discussed in the upper verses 1 to 4. And then verse 6, I don't think there's anything figurative here. I think this is literal, right? May you see your children's children. Now that is a way to say, may you be alive long enough to be with them, but I don't think it's figurative in that sense. And then peace be upon Israel. I think that's also literal. That's a common expression that was used in those times as a prayer, really. So yeah, like you said, Alex, there's not a whole lot of them here. There's only a few in this psalm. I think we have what, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 in this psalm. Okay, and not every verse has them, right? Verse 4 didn't really have any. Verse 6 didn't either. Okay, so that's it, basically the exercise. When you have for your poem, you know, for your when you work on your assignment, you're just going to go through your poem verse by verse and just ask, okay, does this statement seem literal? And if it doesn't seem literal, then ask yourself, okay, what's the figure of speech being used? Is this substituting? Is this a comparison? And then you can kind of just go through the list, all right, and see what you come up with, okay? And again, the purpose of this exercise is not just to be able to, you know, see if you can identify poetic figures of speech, you know, but really it is meant to make you think, okay, what's going on here? What's the author doing? Oh, in this case, it looks like he's using a figure of speech. Why might he do that? Now, in the case of walk in his ways, that was just a common expression, an idiom. So I don't think there's any significance to him using that expression. But in verse 3, when he describes the wife like a fruitful vine, that's a significant figure of speech that he's using. He didn't mean literally, so he's intentionally using a figure of speech to convey an important image there, that the man who fears the Lord will see blessing in his home in the form of a wife who's like a fruitful vine. And so what is a fruitful vine? Well, we talked about that earlier. A wife that is productive, that is a blessing, that brings joy, that brings comfort, that brings children, potentially, all those things. Then the simile of the children like olive plants. There's a future hope, there's security, there's provision, okay, and joy, right? When you so sometimes a figure of speech, as you think about what it is, that can help give insights into what the author is doing. So as I've said quite often with these different steps, they're just intended to make you look at the poem in a different way, looking for something specific. In the previous step, it was parallelism. So you're trying to analyze how each line is connected. In this step, it's imagery, and then figures of speech or poetic devices. So that is okay. What is the author? What kind of devices does he use? And then the kind of device, if he is using hyperbole, then you know there's emphasis because of exaggeration. If there is, certain figures of speech will convey, or poetic devices will convey certain ideas emotionally. We'll see that next week when we look at the next step, which is the other poetic devices. There's some devices that are poetic that aren't figures of speech. They're literal, but they're used to convey the emotion or tone of the poem. And we'll see that next time we gather to talk about that. All right. But each of these steps is meant for us to look at the poem from a different point of view, looking for something different. And in doing that, we get more and more familiar with the poem and gain more insights from the meaning of the poem through the use of these different things that the author's doing. Okay. So in the middle of this, it may just seem like, oh, this is figures of speech. What am I? It's like the block diagram. What am I doing? This is all this grammar. Right? What do I need to know this stuff for? Well, it's just part of the several pieces that all together help you to better understand what the author's saying. All right. So if you ignore all of this, or just, if you ignore the figures of speech, or you ignore the parallelism, or you ignore the imagery, you're missing out on one of the ways the author is using to communicate his point. In poetry, you have to pay attention to these things. If you're reading an epistle or, you know, a narrative, you may not need to be concerned so much about parallelism, all right, or certain figures of speech. However, figurative speech is used a lot in other genres, all right. So but it's more commonly used, of course, in poetry. So that said, any final thoughts or questions about this particular step that we did today? Okay, I'll again post the notes and the video online. Keep working on those assignments for your passage, your psalm that you've been assigned. And if you ever have any questions on your passage specifically, please don't hesitate. You can contact me, let me know. I have a question about this, or, you know, is this a figure of speech here in my psalm that I'm working on? Or you know,
it's the same passage, Pastor Tim, no? The same passage in Psalms.
Well, you all have a different psalm.
Yeah, but
yeah,
it's the same assigned passage.
Yeah, just look again. You can go to Canvas, and I showed you the link there, right, for where you can find your assigned passage. It's where all the documents and videos, everything's located, right? So you guys all know how to get there. Hopefully you remember that. Just go to tmai.instructure.com and then log in, and then simply go to the, I have it in big, in about the middle of the page, right, in big font, you know, link to download all files. And there you can just look at each week. There's the handout, the notes, and then if there's an assignment, it's there, and then also the video for the class for that week. And then at the top of that is where it says, you know, your assigned passage and the schedule.
That's where I got tricked, Pastor Tim. I go to the download and I cannot find it on the top of the table.
Yeah, it's you were looking in the table, right? Yeah, I tried to make it bigger now, so hopefully it's clear. But yeah, if you have any questions about your passage, you know, you can ask me, all right? I might not give you the whole answer because I want you to work at it, but I'll certainly, if you're stuck or you need some help, I'd be glad to help.
That's the clue. The clue.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me ask Michael, maybe, can you, or let's see, you open us in prayer, right, Michael?
Yeah.
Kazo, let me ask you if could you close us in prayer?